I'll go ahead and start with you, Seth, because Kale actually sent us this lengthy panel that you hosted at the time regarding Occupy Wall Street. And, I'm curious what your view of Occupy Wall Street was then and how things have changed.
Well, it was kind of a double event in the sense that Occupy was obviously in itself this gigantic event that really dominated the political landscape, certainly on the left, but also beyond the left for a while. But then at the same time, at a personal level, we were just getting Jacobin off the ground at that point. And Jacobin was and is, a political project that had so many concerns that overlapped with Occupy, so many issues that we were particularly interested in that in one way or another were brought up by the Occupy movement, either sometimes in positive ways, sometimes in negative ways. And one of the things that we had intended to do in starting the magazine, one of the things that at the very beginning we were really interested in doing was sort of intervening in the culture of the left that existed at the time, and trying to reintroduce the left to some older styles and mentalities of left-wing politics that had gotten forgotten in this culture, this left-wing culture that had emerged in the U.S. over the previous few decades, and that you could see very on display very vividly at Occupy, which was a sort of horizontalist, anarchist, anti-state, very suspicious of institutions and certainly of the state. Institutions, whether that's political parties or trade unions or whatever. So these are the kinds of issues that we were really interested in intervening about, or in intra-left debates. And then right at that time when we were starting to publish Jacobin, it was a sort of like a gigantic exhibit of all of the contradictions of the left at that point. Including so many of the ones that we thought were really important to talk about and argue about. So, it's in many ways, you look at Occupy and you see a kind of a crossroads, because on the one hand, it is entirely, to paraphrase somebody else, it's stamped with the history of the left as it existed at that time, but it's also was an event where the left was sort of struggling to change itself and discovering new ways of conceiving what political action is. So you had this event that it had been started by, it had been instigated by a small group of anarchists, including David Graeber. He supposedly was the one who came up with the slogan, "We are the 99%." And these people were about as purist and as ideologically committed horizontalists as you could find. And the political culture of their way of doing politics really dominated the atmosphere at Occupy. And yet at the same time, you could see that there was something already that was different, if only because of the nature of the content of Occupy. So the style and the approach to politics was all the way that the American left had been for so many decades. But the content really reflected the ways that the left was being forced to change. So it was a movement that was first of all, the slogan, "We are the 99%," even though it was David Graeber who came up with it. I think that his ideas were a little bit different from some of his comrades, but it's such a majoritarian sentiment. Obviously, "We are the 99%," which it was controversial. A lot of people didn't like the idea that our collective subject that we were creating at Occupy would identify in that way. But it was incredibly effective. I mean, "We are the 99%," I think had an enormous can take enormous credit for whatever success Occupy had in sort of capturing the imaginations of people who were not immediately there. And so
Sorry, yeah, I wanted you to elaborate a little more on some of the objections to "We are the 99%." What was the rationale behind that?
Well, there were a few things, but I think that the main objection was motivated from a position that that said that was basically that wanted to view the antagonisms in American society as being more about sort of different parts of the working class, uh, some of which had been co-opted into supporting capitalism and the status quo, and others who were struggling to free themselves from the yoke of that, of that status quo. And so they were very much, there's a vision of the left from people who tend to be, on the anarchist left, or at least that was the case at the time, whose vision is a lot less, vertical of political antagonisms and a lot more horizontal, and feel that it is papering over the contradictions within, the broad working class to talk about the 99%, which means that you're really saying that almost all of us are on the same side and just a tiny elite is on the other side. People objected to that a lot. And, if you look at the kinds of issues that were brought out in Black Lives Matter, then you can see that there's, the kind of logic that there is there, but as far as the strategic wisdom of framing a protest movement as we being the 99% and they being a small elite, which made a lot of sense and it resonated at the time because, of course, this was after the 2008 crisis, and there was a lot of attention focused on the financial system and Wall Street, and the protests, of course, began in downtown New York around near Wall Street. So that it all resonated and it made a certain kind of sense, and strategically, and this is where I think that was, it was ingenious on David Graeber's part to come up with it. Whatever the truth may be of the complexity of the antagonisms in American society, which obviously don't run just between 1% and 99%. Slogans are not there to be like PhD dissertations and capture like all the nuances and fine truths of the situation. What that captured, though, was an element of was a feeling that was increasing. People were increasingly having that had not been something that people on the left were necessarily would gravitate towards. It was this feeling that that really our society was being sort of run by a group of unrepresented people who didn't care what we thought. We had gone through the Iraq War when 1 million people were on the streets demanding that there not be a war, and they were just ignored. And then the outrages of the financial crisis and the housing crisis and the bailouts and all the rest of it, really so many people who were not political looked for the first time at what was going on, and that kind of a critique that says, our society is being run by a small number of people who really don't care what we think, despite the claim that we live in a democracy. It made a lot of sense. So the slogan made a lot of sense. And so all of those currents were, I think, pushing the left at that moment to reevaluate some of its like received wisdom that had accumulated over the previous decades.
Meagan, what was your I'm sorry, I'm hearing myself. What was your experience with Occupy? How did you live through that time?
Well, I was in my final year in college, and so I participated in the Occupy movement that was on my campus, but I think I had a slightly different flavor. So I went to a liberal arts college that you might know from many scandals, Oberlin College. So we had an Occupy Oberlin, and as you might expect, it was like Seth has said that Occupy in New York wasn't necessarily riven with the identity politics that would come to characterize the next sort of phase of life on the left. It was at Oberlin, and that might just be because some of that stuff originated at Oberlin. So that was my memory of Occupy on Oberlin's campus. Or originated in these elite academic spaces, right? So I did make my way to New York. I think that it was for Thanksgiving break. So it was just, some hangers on essentially in Zuccotti Park. I was not there as necessarily a political participant. I was, I believe, rolling on MDMA. I had a great time. It wasn't very political.
Nice.
So, but, that said, actually the experience, I'm making it sound like quite negative, but actually in the years that followed, I returned often to this question of the 99% versus 1% framing. And it was very clarifying for me in helping me find my way to the socialist left. because at the time I was in communities where there was an analysis of oppression that seemed to be increasingly complicated, and it almost seemed like oppression radiated from every person to every other person. You might be able to do some calculus on the basis of whether or not people checked certain identity boxes, but it was very hard to pin down and almost panoptic, and therefore very difficult to do anything about. It wasn't a very encouraging worldview when it comes to actually affecting change. I remember a few years later having conversations with people where I said, Occupy's now faded into the background, right? And I remember, at this point, the style of identity politics that we see very commonly on the left today had just started to kind of leak out of the academy and Tumblr and the NGOs, and was becoming a little more mainstream. And I remember saying 99% versus 1% makes a lot more sense than most of what I'm hearing. And so my fondness for Occupy grew over the following years as I compared it to the trends that I saw taking place on the left. And I think that Occupy in that sense actually primed me for, it certainly primed me for Bernie. When Bernie was announced that he was running in 2015, I felt like I'd had a few years to think about 99% versus 1%. I'd come to the conclusion that was probably the framing we should use. So I feel more sanguine about it now, actually, than I did at the time. But I wasn't, like Seth, I wasn't actually involved with the intricacies of the Occupy movement because I was, on an, isolated elite campus in Ohio. So, well, that said, I mean, we should talk about what the sort of pros and cons of that framing are. And, over time, I think the socialist movement has developed beyond the 99% versus 1% framing in a way that's actually very helpful and good. But I do think that framing, that binary framing, is kind of a left populist framing that captures anti-elite sentiment and encourages people to think about a direct relationship between exploiters and exploited, or oppressor and oppressed, a more binary and conflictual, antagonistic relationship, which is actually a good basis for priming people ideologically for Marxism. That doesn't mean that everybody who participated in Occupy eventually became a Marxist, certainly not. But I do think that, the rise of sort of Marxist-inflected millennial socialism in the United States in the wake of Bernie actually owes a lot to the popularization of that rhetoric during Occupy as well. So that's my positive spin on the legacy of Occupy. There are also some, negative things. Like, for example, I think that we haven't yet rid ourselves on the left of some of the worst habits that you saw dominating the actual sort of occupations. And one of those would be a kind of, I guess anarcho-liberalism is the term that's often used. Like Bhaskar said something about, Bhaskar Sankara actually wrote an article in September of 2011 about anarcho-liberalism. And I'll read a little excerpt of it from you. He said, the Marxist-derived left was defeated, while social democracy reconciled to the neoliberal framework. These are things that happened in the 20th century. Anarcho-liberalism, in quotes, sauntered in a weird middle ground between both camps. Its representatives had the modest ambitions of the social liberals of the center left, but the flair for the dramatic associated with the most militant anarchists of the far left. So that's his sort of diagnosis. I'm not even sure that we can really say for certain that Occupy had modest social democratic aims, because I'm not sure that it was ever quite clear what Occupy's aims were, but probably if you polled people, that would be true. A lot of those people essentially wanted what became, the Bernie Sanders platform, but with the dramatic flair associated with anarchist direct action.
Yeah, I got the sense from Occupy Wall Street that there was finally, in a very public way, an acknowledgement of issues with our system, right? And I feel like it was a starting off point where then people kind of dove into their own self political discovery, right? And I want you to talk a little more about the anarchy component of it, because, and also what Seth mentioned in regard to the lack of trust in institutions, which on one hand is understandable considering institutions have failed people. But then you kind of fast forward to where we are today, where one of the major policies that's being pushed for and championed by socialists is Medicare for all, which would rely heavily on the very institutions that, maybe Occupy Wall Street at the time was incredibly distrusting toward. Seth, can you weigh in on that a little bit?
Yeah, well, I think that to some extent we continue to see those same disagreements play out in the years since then. But I feel like there was, if you compare the situation today on those issues, like the one that you just mentioned about Medicare for all being a solution to a problem that relies on big institutions, obviously the state, the Medicare system, all that kind of stuff. I feel like in the intervening years on those kinds of issues, there has been kind of a pretty clear one side won the argument and the other side reconciled itself to just being in the minority. And so that was progress. I mean, this is why I think that when we talk about all of the things that we don't like about Occupy, those very things that we didn't like about Occupy at the time, actually, by being there, by existing, I think that in the long run, they contributed enormously to pushing the left towards the kinds of things that we do like. And that's because, and this is always the way that I think movements work, is that, movements try to do things that are stupid, and then they have to deal with the consequences. And in grappling with the consequences and arguing and figuring out why this isn't working and why things are going wrong, that's how movements move forward and how they make progress. And at the time that it's happening, it's incredibly frustrating. But in retrospect, I feel like all of the things that were so obnoxious at the time actually ended up playing a really important role, because by being what I consider to be annoying or obnoxious or just wrong-headed, they sort of took the ideas that we at Jacobin, this nascent Jacobin, wanted to critique, and they put those ideas that we wanted to critique sort of to the test, and in front of a massive, an audience of the whole world. And and then it was a test, and we could all see how well or badly they worked. And I feel like in some ways, we ended up, our side of those arguments ended up winning most of those arguments pretty decisively. Gradually, it took time, it's never complete, and so on. But we ended up winning those arguments, and we won them in the fairest way. It was, let's try your way, let's try our way, and see what happens. And the trying of their way was not always really pleasant to deal with, because often it meant we were doing things that some of us thought were misguided. But if we hadn't done them, then there would have been no fair test. Mm-hmm. And you could see that over the course of the year or two, really just a year after Occupy, so many of the people who me and my comrades were arguing with during Occupy, and they were taking very fiercely entrenched positions in favor of a very hardcore version of their type of kind of horizontalist politics on every issue across the board. And then you'd run into them, or you'd see their byline somewhere 6 months, 7 months later, and they had completely flipped. They were now echoing the kinds of arguments that you were making. That happened over and over and over again. So that's, I think for that we have all of the stuff that was annoying to deal with at the time. We have that to thank for that.
I want to bring up a super chat question that I think is relevant in the interview. So Eclectic writes in and says, I checked Washington Post, New York Times, CNN, MSNBC. They don't have an Occupy anniversary on their landing page. Did none of their thousands of journalists pitch the idea? Did editors reject it? Is it unwitting establishment bias? And, before I give you guys an opportunity to answer that, just want to note that the media's coverage of Occupy Wall Street at the time was incredibly dismissive. They didn't care to really understand what it was about. They just minimized the specific concerns that some of the Occupy Wall Street protesters were voicing during some of these interviews. Even after that awful 2008 economic collapse, even after the figures were coming in regard to crippling student loan debt at the time, they just pretended like it was a bunch of young people who really had no interest in doing anything productive. They were just, trying to have fun, just trying to cause trouble at Zuccotti Park and nothing more. So for me personally, I'm not surprised that they have nothing on their landing pages about the protest. But what do you guys think?
Well, I wasn't paying attention to the media coverage at the time because I was a young person who was just trying to cause trouble in Zuccotti Park. Which is to say that when I went down there one time, I was not like a serious participant.
Maybe they weren't so wrong.
They weren't so wrong. I'm
Yeah,
sorry.
maybe they weren't so,
that's
no.
my bad. But Seth, I mean, you must remember the media coverage at the time.
Yeah, I think that it was. I think it's true that the overall tone of the coverage was pretty dismissive. I mean, there was a recognition that something was going on that was important. But it's true. I mean, it gets hard sometimes to criticize because some of the things that the media were dismissive of were things that, some of us within the movement were arguing, were not such great ideas or not such good approaches. One thing that occurs to me is that I haven't really heard very much in the discussions that I've had so far, like this one about Occupy, I'm just remembering that the big issue that actually dominated most of these, like the specific concrete issue that dominated so many of the internecine arguments within Occupy, was around the so-called demands committee and the whole concept of demands. That was the sort of the key word, and that ended up being the approach that the people in the media generally used to criticize the movement. That they were not made. What are your demands? What are you asking for? Mm-hmm. And the sort of the implication was that what these anarchist hippies ought to be doing is dressing in suits and starting a think tank or something like that, and like publishing policy papers. But within Occupy there was a ferment over the question of whether there ought to be demands, and which ended up being kind of like a symbolic fight over a larger disagreement about what kind of movement it ought to be. And so some people started a demands committee or demands working group because anybody could start a working group, and you could call it the Occupy working group, the demands working group. So some people were like, well, we're going to start a demands working group because there was such a neuralgic opposition to the idea of Occupy having or putting forward any demands on the part of the people at the heart of that anarchist culture who had organized it. So a bunch of people who were dissatisfied with that, they started this working group, and it became a whole saga. It became like a classic within the structures of this non-structured horizontalist apparatus. All of the Byzantine parliamentary maneuvers that you associate with Trotskyist parties, where one party is is doing an entryist thing to another party, and they're using these complex parliamentary maneuvers to try to take over the whole organization. Things like that in this horizontalist movement that supposedly didn't have any of those things, that was going on in spades over the struggle over this idea of demands. And it's so funny because in retrospect, you look at where the left is now and where the disagreements and the fights are. And the idea of demands, I mean, if anything, the left has become kind of hyper demand oriented. Generally, I think it's a good thing, but possibly even it's exaggerated. There's an overly strong focus on coming up with a 5-point plan and demanding that these 5 things change as the solution to whatever problem it is that you're protesting. And so when the media was criticizing or dismissing Occupy, they tended actually to use this critique that sort of overlapped with an internal critique that was being voiced by people who generally saw things more the way the Jacobin did. And in retrospect, it's funny because even those of us who were generally sympathetic to the idea that movements should have demands, at least as one tactic, I look back and you realize that it would have been kind of ridiculous for Occupy Wall Street to have demands, like specific demands, like we in Zuccotti Park are going to demand a 0.025% financial transactions tax or something. It would have been silly. But the fight was over what kind of a left we were going to have, really, more than a fight over what position paper Occupy Wall Street was or wasn't going to be putting out.
If you enjoyed this video from Jacobin Weekends, please hit like and subscribe. That way, you'll enjoy all of our backlog, as well as all of our future content, including interviews, live streams, and clips. Thank you.